Okay, so if you're seeing it correctly, the screen should be sharing. We're about to do our webinar on automation focused on something rather special. One more picture to share, which is the antitrust policy notice. And essentially, the Linux Foundation has an antitrust policy that we link to on our website, and we show it at the beginning of every meeting. And in short, on our website, you'll find the full antitrust policy. And this is to ensure that our conversations are structured in a way that makes everyone comfortable. That's all. Okay, Philip, the screen is yours. So go ahead and share.
Great. Thank you very much.
Perfect. And before Philip kicks off, I just want to say that we're very lucky here to have some information coming in from Philip. You may know him from his work around NextB and, of course, the ScanCode project. But what we're looking at today is something around VulnerableCode, which is an adjacent activity. And it's pretty key towards the issue of what code is out there that we need to be concerned about. Philip is probably one of the world's leading experts in this field. We're very lucky to have his time and super appreciated. Philip, you got this scheduled for us at short notice. I'm going to hand over to you so you can do your thing. Just as a side note to people who are new on the call, our events like this are informal. Please feel free to jump in with questions and comments at any time.
Yes.
If Philip doesn't like that, he'll tell you, be quiet. But he will like it because he's a nice person.
No worries. and just so you know, there's 3 of the contributors and maintainers which are also in the chat, Ritik, Keshav, and Tushar, and they'll be able to field questions on the chat while I'm talking, and I may have them jump in if need be. So, abstract, basically, all or most of the database of known open source software bugs are proprietary, and or if they're not, they're typically privately maintained. And the key issue is, especially when they're private, proprietary, and commercial, is I don't think it's right to put like if it were about breathing, it's not right to put a tax on oxygen. And vulnerability data is really what helps open source software breathe and continue to live. And we shouldn't put a tax on that. And open source likes open, right? So why not all do open data? And what we're trying to do with this is to fix this problem with open code and open data. So I'll be talking about the problems. We'll go very quickly into demonstrations, and feel free again to jump in at any time. I don't see the question on my screen. So if you have a question, please voice it. Okay. Supply chain security for software. I'm pretty sure we'll agree this is a huge topic. There's many different ways to think about it and look at the problem, but what we are focusing on strictly is how we can improve how you discover and remediate known vulnerabilities. So it's a very narrow focus. It's maybe just a pin drop in the ocean of the way to remediate the issues, but that's at least our contribution. And the problem is that there's no really open code and open data quality vulnerability database. I came to the conclusion that's unfortunate is that vendors in this space, they do not want to solve the problem. They want to make sure the problem persists because that's the justification for them to sell software and data. There's always this race to having like the biggest database, like bigger is better, but that's not really true unless you have quality. And it's not about being bigger, it's about being more efficient. And even emerging free databases are problematic because they have an opaque review process and no really community curation it's always centralized. So they really don't solve the problem. They're just, in a way, adding to the race to having bigger stuff. And maybe everybody's trying to pull the thing in its direction, which again, I don't think is the right approach to solve the issue. And we're trying very modestly to solve the problem or contribute to its solution. So if we think about the quality problem, we found, and that's really disconcerting and disheartening, we found vulnerability database that are making up packages that don't exist. So they're saying package foobar123 is vulnerable to this vulnerability, except the package doesn't exist. It's not a big deal in a way. It's probably the smallest of the problems, because if the package doesn't exist, nobody uses it, of course. It cannot be found in the wild. But the problem, it's more a matter of confidence. In these very examples, we've seen cases where these were vulnerabilities published on the GitHub advisory database that were GitHub reviewed. So how much trust can I have in this data that's supposed to be reviewed if they're making up packages? We have databases that invent vulnerable ranges. And I'm not picking on GitHub in particular, because the problem is really widely spread around all the providers, be they free or not. We have databases that invent vulnerable ranges. That starts to be more problematic, because then you may be enticed to apply remediation on the receiving end as a user, even though it may not be needed. Or more common, we have different databases that do not agree on what is the range of versions that are vulnerable to the CV. Now that's really problematic, because if I'm a part of a security team and I'm there to remediate an issue, and I just don't know whether the issue applies in the first place, that means I'm going to have to do extra work. We find also that because there's this rate towards a bigger database, there's often what I call cry wolf vulnerabilities, which are dubious, and they create a lot of churn, because you have to review them, you have to requalify them, and the lack of being able to bring a consensus on this kind of vulnerabilities is really difficult today. And they create more work for every single security team in every single organization, including yours. Now, there's also, on the other hand, the claim of proprietary database that they have like secret premium vulnerabilities that nobody else has, which I think is really problematic, because if they don't share that, they are, in a way, not really different from somebody that would sell a zero-day vulnerability on the dark web, right? These vulnerabilities are for sale somewhere. They are selling them in a way, the same way there. So in a way, they're not different from a bad actor at some level. And very often, they don't publish their finding upstreams to the NVD or other shared database, which just perdurates and expands the issue, because if you don't share this information, even if you're willing to provide them in your database, then you're not helping solving the problem. You're just helping you as a vendor, but not the rest of the world. So meanwhile, in the security team, I would hope that we have security gates which are well organized, and people, and would be the example of vulnerabilities and packages, which are funneled correctly. But what we really have is something like that. It's a total mess, and it means actual vulnerabilities seeping through and actual damage to the security of the internet at large, and typically your company too. So that's the problem. I don't know if anyone has any question there or disagree with some of the problem statement.
No questions on my side at this juncture. It was very clear.
All right, so our solution is to very simply say, let's build a database which has a GUI and an API, and a tool, we'll come to it in a second, called VulnTotal. So that's VulnerableCode and VulnTotal. And the way we go about doing that is that we go and import many different data sources for vulnerabilities. And we're trying to go upstream. Literally, what this means is this discussing with the Nginx maintainers to understand how they publish security advisories so we can import them correctly. Working upstream at Apache, at Postgres, and OpenSSL and else. Plus, of course, including all the other common data sources like GitHub, the National Vulnerability Database, and other data, similar data source like from Linux distribution. The key thing is that everything is keyed by Perl or package URL, meaning that there's very little friction between the package that you can use as a developer in your package management environment, and how you can create an identifier Perl out of that very easily to query the database. And that's really important. In a sense, it's more a package database of vulnerabilities than a vulnerability database of package information. Package first is really key. And that's maybe the difference with other databases like the NVD, for instance. What we do is that we're trying to clean, combine, and merge these records and advisories in one and correlate them. We also track the license of the vulnerability data. Weirdly enough, it looks like no one was ever doing that before, because we reached out to the Debian team asking them what license for your vulnerability advisories. They didn't have one until now. Now they are. Same thing for Ubuntu. In one case for SUSE, for instance, SUSE had a license which was a CC BY non-commercial for some of their feeds, making them practically unusable both for commercial and open source purpose. We reached out, and eventually, after a while, they switched to use a CC BY license or CC BY shell. I can't remember exactly, but the point is we're tracking all the license, which means we have a clear provenance, and we're sure that we can effectively redistribute the data. I question whether many of the commercial efforts doing data aggregation have been properly licensing this data in the first place, because in some cases, and many cases, we were the first one to actually ask for a license. We also came with a solution to what I call smart vulnerable version range, where we came in with a new syntax, part of the Perl spec, to express how you write down the range of vulnerable versions. That's a very simple problem on the surface. It's complicated enough when you actually go into the details. We've built a library called Universe for universal version range, and it's also used by Google OSV, which means that we must be doing some of the stuff not too badly there. And importantly, we're building bots to improve the data, meaning have ways to continuously check what the problems could be, validate the data against external data source. For instance, does this package exist when there's a vulnerability advisories that we've collected? These kind of things can be simple, but again, it goes a very long way. And the whole theme is to work towards quality data such that the churn, the work, and the load that you have on VulnTotal today is lowered. And at the same time, you have more efficient, effective way to deal with security. So raise the bar for the security posture overall and limit the work that's required to reach that. Okay, now that's all talk, right? I'm very good at that. But can I prove that this is better? You know, it's very good to say, oh, yeah. So as they say, you know, in God we trust, and everybody else bring data. And we have that. So that's VulnTotal. And think of VulnTotal as a comparison shopping for vulnerability database. There's the name is inherited from a tool from Google called VirusTotal. VirusTotal is a place where you upload one file and you're going to run like 50 different virus scanners. So you can know that, oh, Kaspersky tells there's a virus there, but Avast doesn't agree, this kind of thing. And the idea is exactly the same. You input a package URL, so an identifier for package version, and it's going to query all the different vulnerability database to tell you whether a vulnerability applies for this package, which one, and which version ranges are concerned. So really think of it as a comparison shopping for vulnerability database. And I think Eshav is on the call too. So if you have questions there, feel free to ask. Now, the workflow for the solution, we're going to go there in a second, is you scan for packages. Output is package URLs. You can use scan code, but you can use orcs, you can use Stern, you can use pretty much any tool today that you can find supports package URLs and would output package URLs. And then you look up in VulnerableCode. So very simple, very low friction. Let's go to the demo. Before that, any questions so far? All right. So let's start with VulnerableCode. I'm using a public instance, but you can install this entirely on-premise and have the exact same results. We provide a seed for the database. As I said, it's both open source code and open data. And if I search for a package, obviously log4j is a popular target. We heard a lot about it. And I can see that's the UI, but I have also an API to the same effect here, and pretty extensive documentation. If I dive down, I can see what are the vulnerabilities that are affecting a package and which vulnerabilities are fixed by this package version. And I can dive down, of course, and you have, when I said we have some issues in terms of inconsistent data and lack of data clarity, you can see right away that we have different scores for the same vulnerability. Sometimes it says medium, sometimes it says critical, sometimes it says moderate. I mean, think of it again as a security team that's in charge of handling vulnerabilities. And I'm doing triage. Now I'm being faced with, is this critical? Is this medium? Is it moderate? That's the kind of problem we're surfacing for now. We're not able to solve them yet, but just to give you an idea of the issues there. You can see, of course, what are the packages that would be fixing. So the one you would want to update to, which are the versions which are affected. And in this case, there are popular vulnerabilities. There's a lot of third-party references. We also track CPEs, by the way. If you ever have tools internally that use the CPE or its common platform enumeration, it's the package or product identifiers currently used by the NVD. We support that, but we also even provide a data set that can match CPEs to package URLs, because by virtue of having a cross-reference and correlated database, we're able to do that. We ingest both the NVD and the source that gives us a Perl, and we're able to safely relate the two. So that's vulnerable code. Again, you can use that from the command line. You can use that through the API. You'll get the same. This is a public shared instance. We request an API key for now, just because we don't want the server to go down. But again, there is no restriction here. Everything is Apache license for the source code. The data overall is CC by share alike. The reason why it's CC by share alike is that's the least common denominator across all the data sources we have in VulnerableCode. We have a lot of CC by and quite a bit of CC by share alike. So the common denominator is a limited copyleft license, which is the resulting, not really so much of our license, but the resulting license of the data that are being aggregated from all these sources. So the second thing we're talking about is VulnTotal. And so VulnTotal is a command line tool for now. I cannot run it as a server. I'm going to explain you why in a second. And what it does, I give it a Perl, in this case log4j again. And what it's going to do locally on my machine, it's going to query. I'm just having a textual output here, simple one. It's going to query snic, of course, VulnerableCode. It's going to query GitLabs, debs.dev, the open source VulnTotal database, GitHub, snic again. It's querying GitLab, and it's querying OSS index, and so on. So it's querying a lot of different vulnerability databases, trying to figure out and scrape them to extract both CVEs and vulnerable range. And immediately what you see, it's like, it's all over the map. The syntax, of course, of old vulnerable range is different. That's why we use universe. But if you dig into the details, it's really messy. It feels like on the surface, no two database is able to come with similar results. I'm not saying VulnerableCode is perfect, but at least we're trying. The reason why we cannot share and run this as a service is that it will be a violation of the terms of service of likely snic and OSS index and GitLab and else. And so you can run it locally. We're providing the code. Individual usage is likely not a contradiction with the terms of service of each of these providers. If you have a commercial subscription to that, you probably, and we could work out if need be to enable private API access. Also, we're adding more sources as we go. But we cannot expose this as a shared services, unfortunately, like VirusTotal would be. We're working in the near future to have a GUI way to run that, likely as a browser extension. So you can run that in your browser without having anything to install. And again, I think it's acceptable to use it personally, but would be a violation of the terms of service if we were to run it as a service, which is a shame, but hey, that's it. So that's VulnTotal. Basically, you've seen most of what we do now. Let's look at a few other things. And you know, we were saying earlier on, we have issues. What are these issues? Example here. We have in SNCC an incorrect version range where the affected version here is supposed to be fixed here and it's incorrect. One example. We have another example here in GitHub where in one case we have a version range that says all the versions below 3.6 are vulnerable, but at the same time, it's also all the versions which are superior to 4.3. So it's like, you know, pick a battle. You cannot be above and below the same versions as being vulnerable. So that's another issue. Or another example where we have junk CVEs which have been rejected by the national vulnerability database as being, you know, invalid. We were talking a bit earlier on about these because they create churn. And if you use this package in Golang and you're receiving an advisory that you may be vulnerable, you're going to have to review that. But this still exists in a few places, and that's problematic. We have many more examples of that. This is a funny one. BigO is something which is written entirely in Go, as you can see here. But somehow GitHub makes this GitHub review advisory also for a non-existing NuGet package. I don't know how they make that up. The problem for me when I'm aggregating this data and I'm trying to find the ground truth is how much confidence can I have in a data source that says, I've reviewed this, but I'm making things up at the same time. Another case would be when vulnerabilities are disagreeing, or database are disagreeing on which range applies. So here we're saying that's 2.0 to 4.14. But here we're saying it's 2.0 to 7. So maybe one of the two is right. You know, I don't know for this specific one, but you cannot be both also under 7.0 and, well, so in this case, it's under 7.0, it's supposed to be back. So the ranges are different. Maybe the one from GitHub is correct. Maybe the one from the NVD is correct. But again, which one? Another example is Apache Tomcat here, which says, look, this CVE here is fixed in Apache Tomcat 7.0.8.8, but it also affects 7.0.8.8. And so you could say, okay, maybe it's the range is excluding the upper bound. No, it's not. Everything else in Apache Tomcat vulnerabilities is including the boundaries of the range they provide. I don't blame Apache for that. It's just that we as a receiving end want to mix, we're going to help them, something we've discovered recently. We as the manufacturers of database are aggregating all this data, and we would want to have this correct. So you're not in the case where you say, oh, I cannot use 7.0.8.8 because there's CV 1336. In fact, it's the one that's fixed. So that's the essence of the problem. If we go back for a second to the presentation, I wonder if you have some questions at this stage. I would hope you would have some.
Well, actually, I have a starting question.
Yes.
You mentioned some very interesting information about the way that we can access the tool from a web site. There's some limitations, of course, because of things like hosting capacity. and we can set up a local version of some of the tooling as well.
Yes.
And you also mentioned that some of the data analysis, like let's say having a look at what's in the SNCC database, of course, you can pretty much only do yourself. It's not like someone else can provide you access. So in short, it looks like this is a great way to have some access to aggregation on the web service, a great way to self-host. But fundamentally, then we're still in this field working around aspects of the data silos. Where,
Not
yeah,
exactly. I get your point. I get your point. So the vulnerable code itself, so the tool you're going to use from an partial perspective to look up the vulnerabilities that affect your code, you can use it as is, and that's all you need. VulnTotal is an adjunct to do comparison shopping. So VulnTotal, you can only run it locally. VulnerableCode is a shared resource that you can run centrally if you want to use the demo environment that we've put together. And if you need to do serious evaluation, send me an email so we can remove the throttling on the API, or just take the time to install it locally. We provide the database dump and seed, and you can run it entirely offline, air-gapped, as you like. So this silo thing is mostly resolved, but not entirely. So I'll come back to in a second to the second problem, which is you're mostly right when you say it's still a silo of sorts, because each time you're aggregating more database in one place, you're still recreating a new database, which is a silo. And I don't want to have a centralized database for this.
of course. Of course. And that's a really clear answer. Thank you so much, Philip. And
yeah,
I saw we have another
jump right
question
away on that, because
okay.
that's actually, there's a slide on this. Where is this? Yes, that's what I wanted to do, to show. So to your point, and that's part of the answer, is today you can self-host, you can use the central instance, but what we're looking on as an X-ray is a way where things would be really federated, meaning multiple installation could collaborate together, and that the data is shared also potentially between different instances, such that there's nobody that has control, but it's really shared control for everyone. We're not looking at having like the bigger thing that's under the control of NextB and the project. We're trying to put together resources so we can have this shared and under everybody's control. So that's maybe better answer to your original question.
That's really good. Thanks so much, Philip. And we have a second question in from Alberto. Are you automatically checking for those upstream data inconsistencies in VulnerableCode?
That's correct. So what we have is what we call improvers. And what these are jobs like bots that go about checking the consistency of the data, which could be self-consistency within the database itself, or checking against other sources. Very simple stuff. How do you find that BigO doesn't exist as a nugget? You go check in the nugget package API whether there's a BigO package with this version, and you find out it doesn't. I mean, we didn't invent this stuff, or we didn't spend years trying to figure out if every single advisory package would exist or not. So that's exactly what it is. And we are also working next on something which is an advisory clarity score, such that we can score the clarity and confidence we have in each of these data providers. Because of course, and it's obvious based on some of the issues we have found, is eventually, if you have data source that cry wolf, that provide lesser data, and I will be very gentle when I say lesser data, and I will not use French words. We need to find a way to decide if we want to crowdsource the creation of these vulnerabilities. We need to find a way to decide which one are reputable, which one are not. So right now we're building this advisory clarity score. I think in the end, there's so much mess that even if we're trying hard to put ways to fix and clean the data that's provided, we are going to need to review and have experts review and share the review of this data in a way that's open, and it's a way that's very non-opaque as it's done otherwise. And if there's bots, that's great. But it has to be declared as being bots, because otherwise we see really weird stuff. So the answer is yes. How many of these we have? That's the ones we call improvers. A certain number, not enough. And we're working towards putting some of that. There's quite a few small projects for the upcoming Google Summer of Code in that domain. Does that answer your question, Alberto?
Alberto, you can also unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you, Philippe. That was very clear. I just wonder what could be the business model around a collaboration among security experts in curating those data. I'm asking that because we are facing the same problem in a similar project. We want to establish to do the same for license the metadata curation. So I don't know if you have any idea in mind on how to put people together.
I think there's no business model around this. My ambition is to level the playing field such that everyone has access to quality data, and we've built security commons. So I think the business model there is not a business, it's something that needs to be funded by its users at large, and be they commercial actors, government actors. It's a must. So it's not like a nice to have, something that must be funded. Today, we don't intend to make a business out of that. If we have early adopters that are willing to fund the work so we can support our effort, that's how we work. We've received some grants from the European Union through the NGI Zero program and NLNet. I strongly encourage you to look for that. But there's no business model around that. It's a gift to the community, and eventually we don't intend to even keep the control of that. Ideally, we'd want to create some kind of a non-profit consortium that could support and maybe organize the governance and the funding around that. But again, there's no business model. I think once we have quality data, there'll be probably new business model that may emerge on top of folks that instead of building a business on a data moat, will create a business out of providing real value with tools that really provide something new.
Okay, thank you.
By the way, you mentioned licenses. That's another topic we could have a discussion on at some time. And I think you were you at FOSDEM this weekend?
Yeah.
Yeah, we should have met, but I missed you. I'm sorry. I was a bit short on time. So let me go back. So the point is, let's make sure we exchange and have some discussion. To me, there's no business model, but there's something that needs to be done to make sure it can be sustained for the long term, for everyone and by everyone. So Let me get back to the floor unless you have other questions right now.
No other questions right now. Just, well, if I might just interject,
Sure.
I just noticed ANELNet funding that is
Yes.
something very cool. And they've been so formative in many initiatives in Europe. Like when I was setting up the legal team for Free Software Foundation Europe, they were the funders. So it's just a side note that it's great to see them continuing to push forward boundaries.
Yeah, no, they are, and it's I think it's an essential resource to fund open source development, to secure and sustain the internet at large. It's a non-profit organization that's based in, let me put them on screen. It's a non-profit organization that's based in the Netherlands, and they provide funding, small grants for open source projects that do good worldwide. You don't have to be Dutch. You don't have to be European in most cases. There's a few exceptions. And they have a very low friction grant request program. And I know some of the folks there will hate me to publicize ANELNet because they will have too much work, where they will receive, I hope, your grant request. But I strongly advise that you consider them. The submission process is extremely low ceremony and simple. So if you have a great idea to make the world a better place with open source code, you should go there. So I've talked briefly about package URL, and I created package URL originally for VulnerableCode and scan code. And interestingly enough, today, it emerges as really the critical glue between many software supply chain tools. And that's awesome, meaning there are other databases of vulnerabilities like OSV or a commercial OSS index that use package URL as a key. And there are many supply chain software, so software supply chain security and software supply chain tool that use package URLs. It's really the glue where you can have the output of a tool and easily use that in another tool thanks to this small identifier. So you can check out some folks recently, it's heavily used in CycloneDX, a bit less in SPDX, but some folks that there was a recent suggestion to actually use that as an identifier for the National Warranty Database. I've been frequently invited by the United States CISA to make presentation on Perl, and so that's pretty cool. If you don't use it in your tool, you should. Again, that's a way to very simply lower the friction between tools by understanding which package you talk about across tools. Very proud of that. We discussed about the need to decentralize. We have a plan for that. Now, in terms of next steps, the thing we're working on is, I said, a clarity score. Being able to just measure the trust, the completeness and clarity of advisories we have is essential. Otherwise, it's a total mess. We need to be able to collect also fixed commits. And fixed commit and patch that actually are correcting a vulnerability are really important for many cases. But there's two essential areas. The first one is when you do embedded systems. When you do embedded systems, most of the time, you don't have a package manager. You're just using upstream C, C++ native code that you would very often vendor in your code tree. And it's not always obvious how you can determine if the version is there, which version you use. And if you have the fix for a given package, and you know which code fixing a patch, or which patch or which commit is fixing a vulnerability, then you can use this information to actually do a static lookup in the code to see, has this fix been applied? So that's one area. The second area, if you do code graph or dynamic analysis, there's a project Eclipse called Eclipse Steady, which does that. And if you think about Log4j, right? Say you found a vulnerable version of Log4j in your code base. Great. Unless you need, whether the configuration specifically that would enable the vulnerabilities there and your code goes through the vulnerable path, then maybe just you may not be vulnerable at all. And being able to lower the churn and help security teams triage the mass of security issues they have. Imagine the mad dash that happened when there were these Log4j issues raised about a year ago now. Being able to triage and understand, is this vulnerable? Do I have a configuration issue that really enables the vulnerability? Am I using code path, either doing static code graph analytics or dynamic analysis? Say you run CI, you trace the coverage of your code and you check whether you effectively run through the vulnerable segments. Could be going a very long way. So we want to modestly focus on collecting the fixed commits to enable the other tools which are smart enough to do this code graph, dynamic analysis, and also potentially being able to find whether patch has been applied or not. We discussed making VulnTotal as a browser extension such that you can run that locally. And again, I explained why we cannot run that as a service. We are also likely working on natural language parsing to extract more information of the vulnerability and advisory descriptions, together with going after tracking vulnerabilities from commit histories and trackers. And that's really important because what you don't know is that bad actors do exactly that. They go mine the commit histories and the issue trackers of the open source project that you are using and use that against you. So it's sad that not all of these vulnerabilities have been published, but we want to make sure they're surfaced because otherwise the bad guys are already doing it. And last but not least, two things. We discussed about how we can share and federate this data so it's not under our control, but also something really cool, which is called non-vulnerable dependency resolution. So the idea is fairly simple, is to keep the barbarians away at the gate. To branch out of Tertiary, which is the VulnerableCode maintainer, and imagine that you could blend the functional dependency constraints. So you have dependencies expressed in all the package managers, which says, I need at least this version of the package, or not this version, and so on. So that's the key about dependency management, functional dependency constraints. And you have on the other hand, known vulnerable ranges that we have in VulnerableCode. If you can blend the two and inject that in a package dependency resolver, you get eventually non-vulnerable dependency resolution, meaning you will not use and knowingly install packages that have non-vulnerabilities, which is probably a much better way than to do it after the fact. So we have for now a working proof of concept implemented by Tushar in the Python inspector tool for Python, but we want eventually to have that working for all the different package environments and all the ones that we support in VulnerableCode and with a range of different inspectors. Hopefully, I would want this to be actually a feature in every single package management tool. It's awesome. There's a paper, by the way, I'll put the link in the slide that I'll share. It's awesome, but it should be part of PEEP, of GoGet, of NuGet, and Bundler, and else. It shouldn't be a separate tool. For now, until this may eventually be adopted as a solution by all the package managers, we're working making it an easy tool. And again, getting back on sustainability, it's something we do because we think that's a problem that needs to be fixed. Sponsored by NextB and European Union at the moment, even though we're a US-based company. And we're looking for help. So I think that's something that if you think is worthy, you must fund this, or you must help to make it work, either with sweat or cash.
Now, we had a question in from Yari, which is related to this. He was just asking if OpenSSF could make a useful home for this.
I'm sure it can. I'm sure it can. There's
okay, so maybe that's a dialogue
yeah.
that we could look at in the future.
Definitely. If it can be a neutral place to sustain and support the actual development work that needs to be done for that, that would be awesome.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yeah, like one thing why I was thinking the OpenSSF is that because to my understanding, they got quite good funding from all the big tech companies. So who knows?
Yeah, if it's a possibility, that would be really awesome. And to me, the point again, we're not looking at making this a NextB thing, but something that's shared by everyone and that improves the security commons at large. Taking back the analogy of oxygen, it's wrong to put a tax on oxygen. Everybody needs to breathe.
That is fantastic. I did notice one thing from Tobias in the comment section about finding a non-vulnerable version of code, I guess he means. I saw that Renovate is doing something for OSV to suggest security updates, and he wanted to just mention that it'd be interesting if that was compatible. This is way outside my skill set, so Philip, I'm guessing you know what he's talking about.
I don't know everything what he's talking about, but if that's of interest, let me paste that in the chat. It's a paper we've published specifically on how do you get chat?
Yeah, exactly that paper. That would be really interesting. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, I've pasted that in the chat. It's a paper that's been written by Tushar with my support. And if you want to see a practical example of a proof of concept implementation, you have that here. We're planning also to make that available in ScanCode.io, which is, by the way, another thing to consider in terms of integration. So ScanCode.io is also open source. It's a scanner. It has this ability to effectively collect package information from containers, virtual machine, and many data sources. Here is a simple example where we've uploaded a requirements file to a list of Python packages, which was then dynamically resolved. It doesn't do non-vulnerable dependency resolution yet. It's not been fully integrated, but then it runs a pipeline that then looks up the vulnerabilities in VulnerableCode. And you can see some of the things comes up. It's very simple proof of concept now. It shows that, for instance, you have a vulnerability for this version of PyPI package called cryptography, and you have the details there. So that's also part of the things we're trying to make sure this can be used in a complete workflow with some of the other open source tools we have. And Alberto, if you're interested about license, you should look a bit at Skenko Toolkit, because that's considered to be the leading tool in the space for license detection.
That is brilliant. There is a new question from Dira.
Yes.
Just asking, there's a slide on self-hosting.
Yes.
They were joined late. What would be the self-hosting part? Would it be providing a server for providing data? How would the self-hosting look like? So that's the question for Dira. So the specifics of what would self-hosting be? And I'm guessing the answer is set up an instance of the app, but over to you.
Exactly. You download the app. There's full documentation for that, and we provide database dump. There's new one that's going to come up as a seed, or you can just redo the whole data collection, which gonna take a couple of days. So it's not the end of the world. But we provide data dumps there, and you have full documentation on how to install and run VulnerableCode there. It's not perfect yet, but it starts to be not too bad. At least all the installation is pretty straightforward. There's a lot of reference documentation on how to contribute, which is useful, but not the most useful from a user perspective. But you can install it as a set of Docker images. We have examples, and we have contributed Helm charts to deploy it in Kubernetes. And that's pretty much it. The whole point is that when you run it locally with the database. There's no phone home, you're fully autonomous. You could run that once you have a database, if you don't need to update it immediately. You could run that in a complete air-gapped environment if need be.
Fantastic. Well, Philip, we're hitting the top of the hour, so we're going to have to wrap it up there, but thank you so much for a truly fascinating presentation, one of the best we've had in a long time.
Thank you.
We're going to be publishing this on the website. We're going to be promoting it. And one of the outcomes is we're going to be looking for people to know that they should get engaged, helping with it, and looking at financial resources to make sure that this can sustain and flourish. And also everyone, Philip will be back very shortly. He ran a great workshop in FOSDEM, and he'll be briefing us on FOSDEM later this month in another webinar. So we'll be seeing you again very soon. Listen, thank you again, Philip. This has really been exceptional. And on behalf of everyone on the call, really appreciate it and look forward to having you back in around 2 weeks for the next webinar. Meanwhile, I'll be publishing this and promoting it within 48 hours.
Yes.
And if you want any closing comments, just over to you to wrap up.
Yeah, well, again, I'll be sharing the slides so you can share that with everyone. We need your help. We're a small team, small organization. We like to eat like birds and poo like elephants, but in the end, we need help. We've been grateful to receive some help from NGI and NLNet, and we need more. This is entirely to build security commands for the greater good, and that's pretty much it. You must help us fund this project. That's a must.
Well, let's get to it. I'll publish this within 48 hours and start promoting it globally. That's beautiful. Take care, everyone. Be well, stay healthy, stay happy, and see you all soon.